Singapore, a small, practically diminutive nation-state with just over 5 million inhabitants and barely 730 square kilometers, within which hides a true military powerhouse that could be even more powerful than Israel. Tiny but dangerous, Singapore has had to carefully manage its external relations due to its small size and highly strategic location. What few know is that it is armed to the teeth, preparing perhaps for an imminent threat. In this video, through analysis and hypothetical situations, Factfetch'd will try to answer the question, will Singapore go to war? Located strategically but without natural resources or territory, this city-state has faced various geopolitical challenges that have greatly influenced its security policies and strategies. Initially, it had a close relationship with the United Kingdom. But during World War II, it fell under brutal Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945. Imperial troops invaded Singapore in just 6 days, marking the worst British military defeat in history. Over 80,000 Singaporean civilians and Allied prisoners of war perished under Japanese rule due to hunger, diseases, and forced labor exploitation. The population endured the ravages of war and harsh enemy repression. It was tough, and it left a big mark on the country, making it want to be more in charge of its own safety. Singapore was a British colony until 1959, when it became an autonomous state within the Commonwealth. In the early years after the British withdrawal, Singapore joined the Malaya Federation, along with Malaysia, Sarawak, and Sabah. But, as is often the case in international relations, things weren't all sunshine and harmony. When has it ever been? Exactly. While, on one hand, this union economically benefited Singapore with the creation of a common free market, eliminating tariffs and easing unemployment, problems arose from the start. A racial tension emerged between Malays, the dominant ethnicity in the Federation, and the Chinese, who were dominant in Singapore. Although, to be fair, this tension existed before, but it became glaringly evident, escalating dramatically in just a year. The Federation was formed in 1963, and by 1964, everyone was restless, bickering like in a neighborhood association. Can you believe it? They added one more ingredient to this mix of tensions. Indonesia, the country right next to them, declared a state of confrontation with Malaysia and started military activities against the newly formed nation. This included the bombing of McDonald House, a historic building in Singapore, by Indonesian commandos in March 1965, killing 3 people. The reason? Indonesia insisted that Malaysia, or the Federation of Malaysia, was a British puppet state, and having Malaysia around would only increase British control in the region, threatening Indonesia's independence. They also strategically took advantage of these tensions between Malays and Chinese to somehow break them from the inside. It never fails, right? Long story short, the conflicts made the governments poorer. The agreements for a tariff-free common market weren't respected because there wasn't much money, and they had to get it from somewhere, right? So with not many options left, Singapore said, I'm out. Well, kind of. The truth is, they were kicked out of the group to avoid more fighting. That's how independent Singapore started in 1965. So how did the relationships with their neighboring countries turn out? The answer can be summed up as, it's complicated, and we might be understating it. After splitting from Malaysia, the Malaysian government tried to control Singapore through its military, economy, and water supply. This pushed Singapore to build up its own defense, create diverse economic ties, and safeguard its water security. Despite Singapore's efforts for mutually beneficial cooperation, Malaysia still views its small neighbor with suspicion. According to Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, in his book From Third World to First, Malaysia looks down on Singapore's progress despite its size. Years later, the relationship improved, but tensions linger. Disputes over airspace control and Malaysian envy of Singapore's success fuel the rivalry between these complex partners who are inevitably tied together. On the other hand, Indonesia initially made it clear that it had no intentions of making territorial claims over Singapore, but adopted a somewhat hostile attitude towards doing business. Fortunately, both island nations shared significant economic interests that began to outweigh any other differences. Now you might wonder, what's the deal with Indonesia that doesn't quite click with Singapore? Well, blame it on the communists. Since the Confrontasi War we mentioned earlier, Indonesia wanted Singapore to control the Chinese communists in its territory. The goal was to prevent the spread of those ideas to Malaysia, forming a kind of conspiracy against both governments. Were the Indonesians being overly paranoid? Maybe yes, maybe no. But Singapore had also become very friendly and a partner with China, and this naturally raised alarms. Around the same time, the United States entered the picture, and Singapore became a key ally. Yes, you heard it right. Singapore, neutral or opportunistic, however you want to see it, had both China and the United States on its side. In fact, Singapore has strengthened its defense relationship with the US, a major supplier of many advanced equipment that the city-state imports. For many matters, Singapore can serve as a neutral venue for meetings and negotiations among officials from China, Taiwan, and the United States. It's a friend to both China and the USA, and it doesn't believe in picking sides between them. Instead, it chooses to be like overlapping circles of friends, as stated by Vivian Balakrishnan. This strategy has worked well so far, even when the conflict between Ukraine and Russia erupted. With China and the USA on opposing sides, Singapore stepped in to prevent the relations from breaking down. At the same time, this neutral nation is building one of the most powerful military forces ever seen. Just pay attention. Singapore, a small nation with only 5.5 million people, boasts one of the highest military budgets per capita globally. In 2022, its defense spending reached $1966 per person. To put it in perspective, think about Israel. They're known for their military, and they spend $2,723 per person dealing with their ongoing issues with Hamas. But the difference between them is just a bit over $600. Right now, Singapore is ranked 4th in the world for how much they invest in the military compared to their population. That's pretty amazing when you think about how small they are. Singapore is a military powerhouse. We're talking about a top-tier military force capable of standing up to almost any country in the world. They've got one of the best-equipped armed forces globally, with over 70,000 pros and about 950,000 reservists. And get this, every guy in Singapore has to do 2 years of mandatory military service. But it's not just about the number of soldiers. In modern warfare, it's also about the cool tech and military gear. Singapore, being one of the richest countries, hasn't held back on that front either in the past few decades. Take a look at this. Singapore has more fighter jets than countries like Canada, Sweden, or the Netherlands. They've got top-notch equipment from the military industries of the United States, Israel, and Europe. And guess what? Singapore is the first in the whole Southeast Asia to get the super advanced F-35 fighter jet. Why? Well, Singapore is super rich and a safe place legally. It's where lots of investors and companies from around the world put their money. And when you're in that kind of position, you need protection. Judging by the numbers, they've got that part figured out. Since they became independent, this little Asian country has had 3 big military plans. These plans show how they see the world, and over time have made their armed forces pretty big and well-equipped. The first plan, Singapore's big defense strategy, came right after they got their independence. It was thanks to Lee Kuan Yew, the famous first prime minister who shaped Singapore as we know it today and led for 20 years. After splitting from the UK, joining Malaysia, and getting kicked out in just 2 years, Lee Kuan Yew was sure that for Singapore to stay safe, it had to become a place that nobody would even think about invading. The goal was to make invading this place so costly in terms of money, lives, and military resources that no other country would even think about it. Singapore's defense had to be tough enough to cause big problems for the enemy, even if they somehow managed to take over the city. If that happened, Singapore would be like a poison pill. Now, how do you make all of this happen? Basically in 3 ways. Load up with weapons, get ready for a fight, and make strong friends. When Singapore became independent, they had almost nothing in their army. Just 2 groups of soldiers, an old cannon, and no fighter planes. They had to build an army almost from scratch. To make it work, Lee Kuan Yew, the big boss at the time, told his defense minister, Goh Keng Swee, a secret mission. Singapore had to become friends with Israel, Egypt, and India. And guess what? Israel was super excited about it, being a country looking for pals around the world. So not only was Israel one of the first to say, "Hey Singapore, we see you," but by October 1965, just 2 months after Singapore declared independence, the Israeli military was already helping set up the armed forces of this brand new country. Singapore's second military plan was all about getting a modern army. They became big customers for the military stuff from the US, Israel, and Europe, making them super influential. Plus, they started making their own military gear, turning Singapore into one of the top 30 countries selling weapons around the world. Some of their successful equipment includes the SAR-21 assault rifle, the military all-terrain vehicle Bronco, or the Terex armored transport, along with various drones and artillery. But that's not all. Currently, Singapore is rolling out its 3rd major strategy, building an impressive air force, strong and agile, capable of anticipating any threat. In other words, achieving total air superiority in the region. To make this happen, the current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, has this big plan to get the whole military ready for this new mission. Part of the plan includes getting rid of the old F-16 fighter jets and bringing in the fancy F-35Bs. They're also upgrading and adding more ships to the Navy. Right now, they've got 6 frigates. The Air Force has 60 F-16C D Block 52 plus fighters and 40 F-15 SGs. a souped-up version of the F-15E Strike Eagle. They've also got tanker trucks and early warning planes. Fun fact, a bunch of their fighter planes is actually based in the US, because Singapore is tiny and needs more space. Remember this detail for later. In terms of weapons, they've got German Leopard tanks, their own combat vehicles called Hunter, and an American missile launcher called Lockheed Martin M142 HIMARS. Singapore went from being a city with lots of military stuff to an unbeatable fortress, and now a military player that can go on the offensive. Thanks to their friendship with Israel, Singapore buys a ton of Israeli weapons, like the recent purchase of the Matador anti-tank weapon. All this military capability might make you wonder, what kind of war is Singapore getting ready for? Well, as neutral as Singapore may seem with its friends and partners, there's a lurking threat. Beijing claiming the South China Sea as its own. China has been reinforcing its presence by building artificial islands and expanding its fleet, including aircraft carriers. China asserts control over a significant portion of this crucial waterway through which 1/3 of global trade flows. So China's militarization of the archipelagos has made the situation really tense, raising concerns that an incident could unintentionally escalate into a naval conflict. In the event of an armed conflict, Singapore would face a serious strategic risk, heavily relying on these waters for its external trade. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario. China aggressively starts invading the Spratly Islands near Vietnam and the Philippines. Singapore might send patrols to help defend the sovereignty of its allies. This could greatly anger Beijing, seeing it as a betrayal from their partner. Let's say the Singaporean government stands firm in supporting international law. In retaliation, China ramps up military activities near islands claimed by other countries. From that point onward, Chinese warplanes and naval vessels initiate extensive maneuvers specifically targeting Singapore. Beijing issues an ultimatum, claiming Singapore's waters and imposing a naval blockade in the crucial Strait of Malacca. Singapore refuses to surrender its sovereignty. In response, it deploys anti-ship missiles to safeguard its trade. However, given China's size advantage, it would have some leverage if attempting to invade Singapore. Yet, we can't forget the United States, who would definitely step in to defend its strategic ally. Remember when I mentioned that a good chunk of Singapore's air fleet is based in the US, ready and waiting for action? That's why the conflict would escalate even further, giving the US the opportunity to ease tensions with China once and for all. With all this tension in the South China Sea, and considering what's happening in Ukraine and Israel, Singaporeans are really thinking about the possibility of war. A survey found that 83% of them believe that trouble in nearby countries would affect Singapore. So Singapore has this nickname, the Switzerland of Asia, because lots of people there want to stay out of conflicts. But there's a worry because the country is pretty small, and around 36.3% of people think it's tough for Singapore to compete globally. But most people there really back the idea of mandatory national service. Serving in the military. A 93.4% think it's necessary for defense. But there's this Reddit post in Singapore where they're talking about the possibility of war. And many Singaporeans are chiming in, hoping they can steer clear of that situation. As for war coming to Singapore, that will be very unlikely. No one wants to waste resources on a small poisonous prawn. There are other bigger strategic animals around, said one user. It will remain neutral as long as it possibly can, another opined. Nah, Singapore won't have a war unless some other country decides to invade the whole sea, supported another user. Several mentioned that if forced to choose a side, they'd prefer to stay neutral, Swiss style. That being said, the future is uncertain. One thing we know is that Singapore would stand strong to protect its allies' sovereignty, but they'd try talking it out first to avoid a big fight. If things did get heated, their strong defense would give them a head start. But if it turned into a full-blown war with China, the outcome would depend on other powerful countries getting involved, and whether China is willing to pay a hefty price for controlling the South China Sea. Most Singaporeans just want peace, sticking to their tradition of staying out of conflicts, but they're ready to defend themselves if they have to. So the big question is, will Singapore go to war? And will you subscribe to Fetch'd?